save my other PowerPoint for next time. Okay, but here's the part where, do people have any questions or anything you want to ask? Or does anybody have ideas for something they're going to turn in later workshops and they want to maybe ask right now about it? Nobody ever takes me up on that, and I would not have either as a student because I was introverted. But does anybody have any questions before we start talking about John and Robert's stories? Okay. Just a reminder though, I love questions and I love interruptions. Just a reminder. So those of you who are like, when I'm in the middle of like spieling about whatever and I start getting lost in my words and you want to interrupt, interrupt. I'm not the guy who gets mad and is like, why are you interrupting my flow? I'm the guy that wants to know what students are wondering about, because generally everybody's wondering it too, and it ends up making the conversation better. Okay, so, but John and Robert, who wants to go first?
Robert doesn't mind going first.
Okay. Somebody volunteered Robert, so I'm just kidding. I know you. Robert. So let's look at In Search
He
of
doesn't
the Emerald
realize that I'm
City.
on your Zoom call.
It's fine.
Okay.
The thing I like to do first off in my workshops is just go through the piece in a kind of, it's almost a robotic way with no positives or negatives, no feedback for the author, but just kind of go through and talk about what we're seeing on the page so the author gets an idea of what we're all reading. This begins with this first paragraph. My entire life, I think I always wanted to travel, and we go back and talk about this wanderlust that the author has experienced, how he at a young age wanted an RV.
That's true. I don't know if I wrote it in my critique, but when I was a kid, I always wanted to have an RV as well.
And we get a sense of the author's humor
it's a place
as well.
you can live and a place you can drive. It's too important.
And then I'm gonna make this a little bit.
But then I realized that I shit Wi-Fi, so I'm like, oh shoot, I'm a gamer. I can't live in an RV.
We learn also that there's a little bit more going on under the surface, that the author was young and they ran away from home, hated school, hated the day in, the day out, got found. This is something that happens again later in the piece. Again, the humor. There's a lightheartedness here that the author brings to this. So some of us could talk about running away from home when we're 12 years old, and it could be very distressing and troubling. But the humor is always there to kind of rescue us at the end of paragraphs where serious content gets introduced in Robert's piece. Yeah, here we go. 17 years old, it happens again. But we end up going, when we get to 20, we learn that this is more than just a phase that the author's going through. This is something that means a lot to them, and they end up traveling. And this is when we also learn that he has this habit of breaking up with girlfriends on his birthday on the road, which is amazing. I said I wasn't going to talk about the piece, but on the second page, what do we learn on the second page? I have to get other people talking, because listening to myself talk this whole time is driving me nuts. What do we get? What's just the gist of this second page? What do we learn about the author that we didn't know on the first page? Feel free to use the chat if you like. I'll read the chats out loud for people who don't want to. The question was, what do we learn about the author on this page here that we didn't know on the first page?
We know that he's a man to back up his words, because he actually does get the RV and starts traveling. Most people, don't usually walk the walk, but here he is.
Exactly. Sixu writes he's going to take a road trip and he's going to do it alone. We get a little bit of what else do we learn on here? I think that's the main thing. We're getting launched into a journey, and the author has kind of given us this break here. We feel like it kind of has that structure of like, okay, well, there was Act 1, we're going to move into this miniature Act 2 here. And what happens here in this middle section?
That's too late.
We learned that I didn't hold holidays in that high of self-esteem. I'm sorry, I have a lot of stuff crammed on my screen, on my laptop screen, so that's what I'm trying to navigate here. Is I want to keep some of you up in the, so I can see some faces, and then I want to keep the chat screen out, but I also need to be able to see the text. Holidays would pass without acknowledgement. That was the kind of road trip I wanted. That's an interesting thing for someone to say. One, and we'll talk about that after we work through just the basics of what we're reading here. One in which I was completely disconnected from all of it, the routine and the familiar. At 24, I finally understood that those runaway outbursts at 12, 16, and 17 had been about. It's not about hating school, it was about tearing myself away from familiarity. So that's something I think a lot of people can relate to, particularly if you grew up in a small town or a place that felt confining in some way, which I know I did. So that's something we should probably talk about when we talk about this piece. The author ends up in northern Michigan, renting a place, or is that, am I jumping the gun here? I think yeah, this is where, yeah, you end up renting a place, living very inexpensively, writing your memoirs, and kind of giving an anti-self-help guide. After 2 months there, living in the attic, this sounds so romantic, by the way, Robert. And I wonder if it was romantic while it was happening or if it just felt like whatever. This is one of those things a lot of people, they entertain the idea of doing the things you did, but they don't actually do it. And so it remains this romantic idea in their mind. And I'm curious about your thoughts on some of that stuff. And I'm sure we all have questions for you. So you write all this memoir, living cheaply, and the author comes to the conclusion that it didn't matter what I did with my time on the road. It was my time, after all. Maybe I could travel from attic to basement to attic, writing a new book every couple months, staying with different friends around the country for cheap rent while I DoorDash just enough so that I could pay my expenses, food, water, gas. And that's what the author does. Lots of time passed quickly here. It's kind of a breezy summary narrative here where we pass a lot of time. All these things happen. We assume the author has undergone some changes here. And we get some details like this Army colonel paying to write his memoirs, which sounds fascinating. And I have questions about that as well. Eventually, the author leaves that den and goes back out into the world. What happens here? We end the story pretty quickly here, and what kind of note do we end the story on here? What would you say is the gist of it, the emotional takeaway from this last?
It's like a positive note to kind of like summarize all the experiences like back into one, almost like a hero's journey in a sense. The hero kind of, or actually after the hero's journey, I forgot what that part's called. I can't think of it, but you know, like they celebrate.
Yes. Well, they return with the gift, I think, is what you. Or is that not even?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. Like they return with the reward that they sought out to get. So I feel like it's like it comes full circle with the mom and like the joke and things of that nature.
When I'm sharing my screen, the little like thumbs up emojis and heart emojis and all that are not readily available, but I would be using those with y'all's comments if I could right now. Justin writes, I found it interesting that the story ended with the author finding merit in stability. Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about the piece overall then. And I need feedback I need somebody else to talk because I can't stand talking this much without somebody else taking a turn. Sorry, I mean, that's like a lot of pressure on students. I don't mean that. You don't have to talk, but do we agree that this story is about self-discovery? I know somebody threw that out there, and I'm just wondering if that's the main theme that everybody's taking away from the piece, just so the author knows.
that last part?
Yeah. Well, just so the author knows, what does everybody take away from the piece? What would you say is its main theme?
Acceptance?
Yeah, we kind of talked about this already. Yeah, acceptance, self-acceptance, self-discovery.
I say that in the main sense of just kind of you get the idea throughout like the entire story, like the authors, or do I say author protagonist? That's why I was also curious about that. I don't want to email you about that because I feel it's kind of dumb, but I'm curious. Do we say author protagonist when we're like talking about the main character, since it technically is the author, or?
I love that question. So, and anybody can weigh in on this. A lot of you guys know all the stuff that I know already. You know, I don't have a secret bag of wisdom, but I say author because I want to stay in that habit, Dwayne. Because I also teach English, and I teach texts that are not written by students. So sometimes it's uncomfortable, and it gives this distance, I guess, so we can talk about the author of the piece rather than talking about someone who's in the classroom with us. So I usually go for that just to give us a little bit of distance.
Okay, I'll keep it with author. That's fine. That's perfect.
You can say whatever you want. And also, I was going to tell Robert that in my workshops, the author, you don't have to remain dead silent the whole time. If there's something you want to add to the conversation or questions you want to ask, or I know with nonfiction, sometimes people are going to reveal things that are difficult or touchy or emotionally, not the easiest things to talk about with a group of strangers. And in that case, you can always say, hey, maybe I'm not comfortable talking about this part of the piece right now. That's always good too. Or you can tell me beforehand, before your workshop discussion, if there's something you'd rather we don't talk too much about. Anyway, you asked also, Dwayne, about protagonist. And for me, there's kind of a difference between the author or a main character and a protagonist. And the word protagonist kind of sounds like you're pro-tagging, like you're going to go do some pro-tagging. You're doing something active. The protagonist wants something. When I think of a protagonist, I think of an active figure who is, well, you mentioned a hero's journey earlier, something like that, where the author wants something and is taking active steps towards achieving some kind of goal, I imagine, as a protagonist, whereas a main character would be more, they're the focus of the story, but they're not necessarily on some kind of journey or seeking something and being active about it. If that
I feel you. Yeah, no. All right. I'll just say author, just to make it easy. Damn, I'm not even gonna lie though, Professor. Low key, you made me forget what I was saying though. Dang. I guess if we're just going talking about the piece, I liked it overall. I will say though, in my opinion, I feel like one thing that kind of kept me like really disconnected from the piece was like, I felt like there was a lot of vagueness behind like a lot of areas that kind of made me feel. What I write about things? It kind of made me feel like I wasn't really there. Like what, like the obstacles were. I don't know. Like I was trying to understand like if the obstacle was kind of like trying to travel. I was trying to understand like the repercussions that happened as like a child from running away from home. I felt like there was a lot of vagueness behind like why like he would leave home so much. I think even like the big turnaround with the mom in the end, it kind of even made me feel like there's the relationship with the mom that was never kind of like foretold. I felt like I wrote this on my thing. I felt like the time skip from like 12 to 17 to 20 in one page. I felt like it was so large that it was kind of like hard to like really think like, oh, okay, like.
A screenshot of this.
Like I guess it's like the transitions were just too big to really think of like what development that they kind of had in between those times that like had them come to like like these different conclusions is is in a way.
At the very
I don't know
end,
if
Seems
anyone
it will
agrees.
save all of them,
Yeah.
so we have to keep doing it.
Yeah.
You set off a chain reaction. So, because hands started going up and heads started moving around, so I'm going to I don't know who's next exactly, but I'm going to put myself on mute because I know people want to respond to what you said, Dwayne.
Yes, I could start. I feel like a lot
Please
of
scroll
things
that down
happened in this
so we can
piece,
see your
which
face.
was great. It certainly made for an entertaining read. However, I feel like there could have been some greater focus and it would have benefited it a little bit greater just because there's so much happening. You know, it's kind of hard for me to dissect like an exact theme as we were doing now. And that could also be because I don't really think in those terms that often, so that's kind of like a new way of thinking for me. But I feel like if maybe you know, you had chosen to stick with like a rule of 3 and chosen, you know, 3 instances in this narrator's life instead of, you know, countless times of traveling, I feel like it could have been a little more focused, for lack of a better term, and you know, could have made, I guess, some of the deeper elements of this character and who they are and kind of like, you know, what their motivations were shine through, and it wouldn't get lost in just the sheer amount of action that was, you know, throughout the story.
And then I can continue on that point as well. In regards to theme, I feel like the theme is the most clear because of the title. And if we didn't have the title, it's not entirely clear what the piece is getting at because it's only briefly mentioned at the end when you come to this realization in like one little paragraph. And like I'm not, as I'm reading the piece, like I'm not sure what's really at stake because the character runs away in these like 3 moments in their life, and then they're given this opportunity to travel, and they travel, and they experience it, and then they want to go home, and they go home, and they experience it. And like I feel like we're not let into this like the psyche or like the emotional state. And I don't know if I'm like overstepping when I say that, but it feels like sometimes the emotional vulnerability is sacrificed for the sake of like adding humor into the piece. But yeah.
I'm going to read some of the comments to add them to the conversation here. Erica wrote that it feels like he's being the hero to his younger self by going on his journey and fulfilling his dreams of running away. And I agree with Dwayne. I feel like there might be some trauma that we didn't get a full sense of, and that's kind of resonating with what Sixu just said. And who spoke before? Was it Kayla? It's kind of on the same vein. Justin writes, I felt that the beginning paragraphs about running away with the author was young, felt too much like summary. There wasn't much emotional weight behind it to make it feel significant to me. So this is, y'all just jumped out with the criticism without, so just in case, Robert, if you feel blindsided, I did not ask them to start criticizing. So I hope you have thick skin because it kind of just jumped out at us. But usually I like to start out with what do we love, and then we kind of talk about what's not working. But I know it's here's the thing about workshop. The stuff that hurts, the criticism, is the most helpful stuff. I mean, that sadly, that is the truth of workshop. So you're getting the most helpful stuff right now, Robert. Elizabeth writes, I agree with Dwayne also. I felt like I wanted more from the author because it felt like I was only getting a piece of these interesting stories and then they were glossed over right after. Sam writes, I found this piece to be a way to heal his inner childhood when it came to traveling. I would have loved to have read more details about the places you traveled and how it helped your inner child feel free and be able to grow and heal throughout your journey. Justin adds, adding more references to the Wizard of Oz throughout the story could add more weight behind the story, keep it relevant. That also, if you're going to use that in the title, you kind of have made an agreement with the reader that you're at least going to mention it or reference the Wizard of Oz somewhere in the piece. Otherwise, the title just kind of sits in its own land. Sixu writes, also totally agree with you, Justin. It could start on the second page after the break because it communicates the same thing in the first page but with more brevity and weight. Okay, interesting. That's a very specific suggestion, but I'm going to keep reading. Oh, I got a direct message. Oh yeah, that's okay. Don't sweat. Nobody sweat anything. Where does that? Jacqueline writes, I love the opening paragraph, the way it sets up the defining journey the author will take, one we build up to during the beginning section. The story does move fast due to the summary of numerous events and details we learn. I think having more moments like the opening paragraph at key moments where the author has their defining moments could maybe help with the pacing and would be really cool to see. Okay, so it sounds like, and I don't know if we have a consensus yet because we haven't heard from everybody, but it sounds like what people want from Robert is more of those intimate details, kind of like we talked about in the PowerPoint. Like we want to get a little bit closer. I know I wrote this, and you're going to hear this from me as well, Robert. You know, I keep getting thrown off because every time I look at Robert in the little chat screen, it says Justin. Yeah, and that's what throws me off. Every time I'm like, there's this little pause where I think I'm going to call the student the wrong name. But I felt the same way. And here's the good news about this criticism that is happening right now is that you have all the events here. It's just a matter of going back and adding to them and putting flesh on the bones so that we can actually be there with you and kind of feel like we're experiencing these things as you tell them to us. I particularly felt like those breakups were kind of incredible, and like I kind of wanted to get a sense of whether they meant something to you and how awful they were, because I'm imagining my own breakups when I was younger and how horrible they were. And I can't imagine being on the road with the person and you're just like stuck and it's your birthday and you're like, yeah, I guess like whatever led to the breakup must have been kind of ugly. I don't know, but those things, whenever somebody's in a time of crisis or unhappiness, and this is, it gets back to that whole maxim of what's bad for the writer is good for the writing. We're gonna want to know more, Robert, and maybe you don't want to go down that memory, like you don't want to retread old wounds or open old wounds, but generally that's stuff people want. Okay, Robert, you're welcome to jump in whenever you want. This is not a dead author workshop where you just have to sit there and not talk, though a lot of times that is the best because then you can hear what everyone says without kind of controlling what people say. But to me, it sounds like based on what everybody said and based on my own gut reaction, this is the main criticism you're going to get from us, is that we want more, which is a good criticism. It means we didn't quite get as close as we wanted to get to you, the author, and that's what people are wanting. But I gotta stop. I gotta let somebody else jump in with something.
I was gonna say, I hope it didn't look like I was jumping in. I just feel like we're always gonna be like saying like the nicest things. So I feel like sometimes it's just kind of best to go with what like we don't want to go with. That's how I kind of start off. I guess with that. But I will say is, I like the story. I think it's just more like when I think about like this as Sixus has said with the stakes, I kind of think of Lord of the Rings, and I kind of think of like the ring made Frodo invisible. Realistically, he could have ran all the way to the mountain and just threw it in. But each time he wore the ring of immense power, like he revealed himself to Sauron. So I kind of felt in the story, like with Robert's character, there like he just ran away from home every time. He just had the power of the ring. Like there was really no consequence. Like so I kind of felt like maybe if like more was just revealed in that sense, just like everyone else has said, it would totally just reveal like okay, like if there's a consequence, then like the goal and the stakes are just gonna be that much greater. So just like Sixus had kind of said, like there really wasn't too much friction in the things that he wanted. Even like in the breakups, like I said, just like the professor said, Robert, maybe we don't want to talk about it, but like even in the breakups, it seemed like there wasn't too much friction at all either. So it's just like it's like anything that like the author seemed to want, he kind of got. So there has to be some friction, I would assume, and I think like it would just make the story, just kind of emphasize even more that emotional impact at the end, with with just a realization of like, oh, you know, maybe spending like my time with loved ones is what it like, you know, is what I'm really looking for, or something else of that nature. That's just, I just want to throw that in there.
Oh, please throw it in, Dwayne, because you stepped right into my nerd wheelhouse with the Lord of the Rings references. I think everything that everybody has said is helpful for the author so far, because that's exactly what I was wondering as well. If you tell me these breakups happen on your birthday, I immediately, like, my heart kind of tightens, and I'm like, oh, it sounds so painful, you know? But then it's kind of glossed over, and then I don't know if they didn't mean that much to the author, or if the author is preferring to go with a lighthearted, humorous tone. But there's got to be a way to speak to it. Like, maybe you could say something like, okay, I don't want to go into the details. It's safe to say I reached this low point of, and maybe you find a humorous simile or metaphor to talk about how awful you felt or how deep the depths of your grief were over the breakup. But acknowledge it, or if it didn't mean much, acknowledge that. Be like, you know, I never really liked her that much anyway. She used to chew like this, and every time we would want to, like, you know, or maybe she farted a lot. Like, just anything you want to throw in. I don't know the person, so anything you tell me helps me build an image. John?
I can agree with everybody, but I can also understand how the story was written. Because the last thing you want to do is turn in a 20-page or 50-page story. So, of course, he had to condense some things. So I can pretty much understand, you know, leaving some things out. You probably have to juggle what to put in and what to take out.
Agreed. And that's always, so maybe then the question is whether the author can cover, is the author still here? My chat screen changed, so I don't even know if it's
Robert, yeah, he's still here.
Okay, great. The question could be then, John, maybe the author needs to focus more closely on a single event that really caused the change to happen, that made them want to kind of get back to a familiar, predictable life and wake up to the same thing each day. Because I'm not exactly sure what triggered that change at the end. I know that for me, whenever I go on a long vacation, I'm always excited to come home, and I could kind of play through the vacation and talk about all the little things that lead up to me feeling like I just want to be back home. But I'm kind of a homebody, and my life's different than Robert's in a lot of ways. And it's the particulars of Robert's experience that are going to tap into those universal truths that are going to be relatable to all of us. But it's the particular iterations that really, and I want to hammer that home for everybody. The best way to get at a universal truth is through particular iterations of it. And people really do want to know your peculiar way of handling emotions, going through your day, addressing things, getting what you want. Those are interesting. That's how we learn about what it means to be human and how other people do the things, or how they negotiate the roadblocks in life that we've encountered. But anyway, that was the thing for me, is I wasn't exactly sure, besides time and weariness and in just doing it for a long time, I didn't know what brought Robert back to wanting familiar, predictable life. What did we miss in chat? Erica writes, I think maybe going into what those relationships meant to you or describing the partners to make them feel more real would help add to the emotional weight of the breakups. Or you could go into the process of how you reacted afterwards. For example, describing the awkward car ride or staying in bed, something like that. Yeah, I think we're hungry for particulars. We really want those details. Justin writes, more of technical advice. I have shorter sentences. Having shorter sentences could add more bluntness and sincerity, could help with the breakup sections. Okay, lots of advice. I want to hear from Robert. Robert, what questions do you have for us, or what, I need to get a sense of what you're gaining from this, or how you want to proceed from what you've heard from us so far. It's a fairly short piece, and I'm not someone who likes to nitpick in workshops. I do grammatical and punctuation stuff. I note all of that on the manuscript you get back from me, but I don't really like to talk too much about that in workshop.
Could always interrupt.
So I kind of want to rein it in before people start nitpicking about, like, I don't know, any kind of nitpicky stuff. But big picture stuff. Are you still here, Robert?
Yeah, I can put my 2 cents in. So I appreciate all of the constructive criticism. I think that one thing that I always fear with creative writing classes is that we, kind of have to keep like our kid gloves on, right? So we don't maybe necessarily end up learning anything as writers because we're told that, we as artists are very sensitive and we need to be respectful, but I've been writing for a little while of my life now, and I did become I took on creative writing as a second major so that I could improve with my writing. So I appreciate everything everyone has said so far, and the chat as well. I think that it's all really, really constructive. I understand like the need for maybe to go deeper with some of the emotional stuff and maybe to build on some of the things that I left a little bit more bleak.
Was that the end of it?
The ultimate thing I'm just saying is that, no, I love everything that everyone has said thus far. I'm appreciative for the compliments that, John gave me. That I think there were probably, in my way, I was trying to keep it lighthearted and not ruin the tone of it, right? By, not getting too emotional about some of the breakups and stuff. And then also just, I had to cut like 5 or 6 pages from this just so that it could have like a nice flow. You know what I mean? I wanted to get to the traveling, you know what I mean? And I didn't want to bore you guys. Maybe in a longer memoir or something like that, I would love to like make each of these like periods of my life, like maybe 8, 12, like 16, like 17, they could be their own I would love to make them their own chapters. You know what I mean? Maybe we don't even get to the traveling till like halfway through the book. But yeah, I think my main goal, I don't know if anyone disagrees with this or agrees with this, but my main goal just for this piece was to keep it really short and funny. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Sorry, I was on mute because I don't have my headphone. My headphone's broke, and I know the audio's bad if I don't mute it. Yeah, I do know what you mean, and everything you're saying makes perfect sense. I kind of had a feeling that's what you were doing, Robert.
I have to keep talking.
The question, I guess, for me is, I guess it's for I feel like you could get deeper without changing the humorous tone too much. I think a lot of humor can still have those heavy moments or those serious or even somewhat traumatic moments. You can still do what you've done where you kind of save us with humor after you describe something difficult, but I think you could trust the reader to bear with you a little bit longer in the difficult, like go down in the trenches and the mud and the badness, and then come back out with the humor and the triumph and what you gained from it and what you learned about yourself. I think you could trust the reader to put up with a little bit more of the despair or the gloom or whatever, and then it feels cathartic and it feels like a relief and an uplift when you come back out of it and you say, here I am now and I have this perspective about it. Because I remember bad times in my life, I felt like they're never going to end, and I'm just permanently going to be sad now. And then you realize, the older you get, the more you realize everything's temporary. So now whenever I'm super upset or sad or depressed, I just remind myself this is a temporary state. But when I was younger, it wasn't so easy, and you could tap into that. And anyway, I'm kind of rambling, and I can't really know for sure what your life was like. But I think maybe there's a moment in here where we could really slow down and get intimate with you, like where you are, get a sense of the setting, the sounds, the smells, the textures, like really feel like we're there with you for part of it, because it is so fast. It's like we're skimming I feel like we're skimming the surface of a lot of important things in your life. And I even wondered about running away from home. As someone who never ran away from home, that's a big deal to me. Maybe for you it wasn't, but some idea of what kind of home life could be interesting and enlightening and revealing about you as the writer for the reader to understand you better. But I'm not asking you to go into detail about your home life as a child in front of us right now. I'm just throwing it out there.
The reasoning that I sort of went with the ending that I did is, I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen like the movie Forrest Gump, where he's running across the country because he feels like it, and eventually there's just one day where he's running, and then he eventually just gets a feeling in his gut that says, I think I feel like going home now. That was really what it was for me. It was like I just got a feeling in my heart, in my gut, in my brain. It just said, you know what? I've been doing this for 9 months now, and I'm tired of it. I don't know where the feeling came from, but it just hit me all at once, just like Forrest Gump.
Can I say that like the words that you just said kind of read more impactfully than what is written in the story? Like that holds so much more like emotional weight, and I'm so much more struck by the words that you just said than what was in like the writing itself, because I don't feel like that was entirely communicated. Like the final paragraph kind of reads as like redundant. You say the same thing in a couple of sentences, but like I wish I could have just like manuscripted what you just said as you spoke, because that holds a lot more like vulnerability, and I think that communicates way better what you were trying to get at in the theme of the piece.
Yeah, expanding on that a little bit. At the time that I got that feeling, I was in the middle of traveling with another van lifer. We were like in the middle of, we had just like come from like Ohio, Indiana, and we stopped off in Chicago. And my feet were swollen, and I was like starting to like get stressed out about like, like getting prepared to get ready to find a place in Riverside so I can go back to school, and you know what I mean? And just like being tired of, not having like that stability of, you know what I mean, always having to say, okay, where's the next